The steep street led them straight up to a large market-place, with butchers' shops, about which were many dogs. The moment they caught sight of Lena, one and all, they came rushing down upon her, giving her no chance of explaining herself. When Curdie saw the dogs coming, he heaved up his mattock over his shoulder, and was ready, if they would have it so. Seeing him thus prepared to defend his follower, a great ugly bulldog flew at him. With the first blow, Curdie struck him through the brain, and the brute fell dead at his feet. But he could not at once recover his weapon, which stuck in the skull of his foe, and a huge mastiff, seeing him thus hampered, flew at him next. Now Lena, who had shown herself so brave upon the road thither, had grown shy upon entering the city, and kept always at Curdie's heel. But it was her turn now. The moment she saw her master in danger, she seemed to go mad with rage. As the mastiff jumped at Curdie's throat, Lena flew at his, seized him with her tremendous jaws, gave one roaring grind, and he lay beside the bulldog, with his neck broken. They were the best dogs in the market, after the judgment of the butchers of Gwyntystorm. Down came their masters, knife in hand. Curdie drew himself up fearlessly, mattock on shoulder, and awaited their coming, while at his heel his awful attendant showed not only her outside fringe of icicle teeth, but a double row of right serviceable fangs she wore inside her mouth, and her green eyes flashed yellow as gold. The butchers, not liking the look either of them or of the dogs at their feet, drew back, and began to remonstrate in the manner of outraged men. "Stranger," said the first, "that bulldog is mine." "Take him then," said Curdie, indignant. "You've killed him!" "Yes, else he would have killed me." "That's no business of mine." "No?" "No." "That makes it more mine, then." "This sort of thing won't do, you know," said the other butcher. "That's true," said Curdie. "That's my mastiff," said the butcher. "As he ought to be," said Curdie. "Your brute shall be burnt alive for it," said the butcher. "Not yet," answered Curdie. "We have done no wrong. We were walking quietly up your street, when your dogs flew at us. If you don't teach your dogs how to treat strangers, you must take the consequences." "They treat them quite properly," said the butcher. "What right has anyone to bring an abomination like that into our city? The horror is enough to make an idiot of every child in the place." "We are both subjects of the king, and my poor animal can't help her looks. How would you like to be served like that, because you are ugly? She's not a bit fonder of her looks than you are, only what can she do to change them?" "I'll do to change them," said the fellow. Thereupon the butchers brandished their long knives, and advanced, keeping their eyes upon Lena. "Don't be afraid, Lena," cried Curdie. "I'll kill one, you kill the other." Lena gave a howl that might have terrified an army, and crouched ready to spring. The butchers turned and ran. By this time a great crowd had gathered behind the butchers, and in it a number of boys returning from school, who began to stone the strangers. It was a way they had with man or beast they did not expect to make anything by. One of the stones struck Lena. She caught it in her teeth, and crunched it that it fell in gravel from her mouth. Some of the foremost of the crowd saw this, and it terrified them. They drew back, the rest took fright from their retreat, the panic spread, and at last the crowd scattered in all directions. They ran and cried out, and said the devil and his dam were come to Gwyntystorm. So Curdie and Lena were left standing unmolested in the market-place. But the terror of them spread throughout the city, and everybody began to shut and lock his door, so that by the time the setting sun shone down on the street, there was not a shop left open for fear of the devil and his horrible dam. But all the upper windows within sight of them were crowded with heads, watching them where they stood lonely in the deserted market-place. Curdie looked carefully all round, but could not see one open door. He caught sight of the sign of an inn, however, and laying down his mattock and telling Lena to take care of it, walked up to the door of it and knocked. But the people in the house, instead of opening the door, threw things at him from the windows. They would not listen to a word he said, but sent him back to Lena, with the blood running down his face. When Lena saw that, she leaped up in a fury and was rushing at the house, into which she would certainly have broken, but Curdie called her, and made her lie down beside him, while he bethought him what next he should do. "Lena," he said, "the people keep their gates open, but their houses and their hearts shut." As if she knew it was her presence that had brought this trouble upon him, she rose, and went round and round him, purring like a tigress, and rubbing herself against his legs. Now there was one little thatched house that stood squeezed in between two tall gables, and the sides of the two great houses shot out projecting windows that nearly met across the roof of the little one, so that it lay in the street like a doll's house. In this house lived a poor old woman with a grandchild, and because she never gossiped or quarrelled or chaffered in the market, but went without what she could not afford, the people called her a witch, and would have done her many an ill turn if they had not been afraid of her. Now, while Curdie was looking in another direction, the door opened, and out came a little dark-haired, black-eyed, gypsy-looking child, and toddled across the market-place towards the outcasts. The moment they saw her coming, Lena lay down flat on the road, and with her two huge forepaws covered her mouth, while Curdie went to meet her, holding out his arms. The little one came straight to him, and held up her mouth to be kissed. Then she took him by the hand, and drew him towards the house, and Curdie yielded to this silent invitation. But when Lena rose to follow, the child shrunk from her, frightened a little. Curdie took her up, and holding her on one arm, patted Lena with the other hand. Then the child wanted also to pat Doggy, as she called her, by a right bountiful stretch of courtesy. And having once patted her, nothing would serve but Curdie must let her have a ride on Doggy. So he set her on Lena's back, holding her hand, and she rode home in merry triumph, all unconscious of the hundreds of eyes staring at her foolhardiness from the windows about the market-place, or the murmur of deep disapproval that rose from as many lips. At the door stood the grandmother to receive them. She caught the child to her bosom with delight at her courage, welcomed Curdie, and showed no dread of Lena. Many were the significant nods exchanged, and many a one said to another that the devil and the witch were old friends. But the woman was only a wise woman, who, having seen how Curdie and Lena behaved to each other, judged from that what sort they were, and so made them welcome to her house. She was not like her fellow townspeople, for that they were strangers recommended them to her. The moment her door was shut, the other doors began to open, and soon there appeared little groups about here and there a threshold, while a few of the more courageous ventured out upon the square, all ready to make for their houses again, however, upon the least sign of movement in the little thatched one. The baker and the barber had joined one of these groups, and were busily wagging their tongues against Curdie and his horrible beast. "He can't be honest," said the barber, "for he paid me double the worth of the pane he broke in my window." And then he told them how Curdie broke his window by breaking a stone in the street with his hammer. There the baker struck in. "Now that was the stone," said he, "over which I had fallen 3 times within the last month. Could it be by fair means he broke that to pieces at the first blow? Just to make up my mind on that point, I tried his own hammer against a stone in the gate. It nearly broke both my arms, and loosened half the teeth in my head." Meantime the wanderers were hospitably entertained by the old woman and her grandchild, and they were all very comfortable and happy together. Little Barbara sat upon Curdie's knee, and he told her stories about the mines and his adventures in them, but he never mentioned the king or the princess, for all that story was hard to believe. And he told her about his mother and his father, and how good they were, and Durba sat and listened. At last little Barbara fell asleep in Curdie's arms, and her grandmother carried her to her bed. It was a poor little house, and Durba gave up her own room to Curdie, because he was honest and talked wisely. Curdie saw how it was, and begged her to allow him to lie on the floor, but she would not hear of it. In the night he was waked by Lena pulling at him. As soon as he spoke to her she ceased, and Curdie, listening, thought he heard someone trying to get in. He rose, took his mattock, and went about the house, listening and watching. But although he heard noises now at one place, now at another, he could not think what they meant, for no one appeared. Certainly, considering how she had frightened them all in the day, it was not likely anyone would attack Lena at night. By and by the noises ceased, and Curdie went back to his bed, and slept undisturbed. In the morning, however, Durba came to him in great agitation, and said they had fastened up the door, so that she could not get out. Curdie rose immediately, and went with her. They found that not only the door, but every window in the house was so secured on the outside, that it was impossible to open one of them without using great force. Poor Durba looked anxiously in Curdie's face. He broke out laughing. "They are much mistaken," he said, "if they fancy they could keep Lena and a miner in any house in Gwynstorm, even if they built up doors and windows." With that he shouldered his mattock, but Durba begged him not to make a hole in her house just yet. She had plenty for breakfast, she said, and before it was time for dinner they would know what the people meant by it. And indeed they did, for within an hour appeared one of the chief magistrates of the city, accompanied by a score of soldiers with drawn swords, and followed by a great multitude of the people, requiring the miner and his brute to yield themselves. The one that he might be tried for the disturbance he had occasioned, and the injury he had committed; the other that she might be roasted alive for her part in killing 2 valuable and harmless animals belonging to worthy citizens. The summons was preceded and followed by flourish of trumpet, and was read with every formality by the city marshal himself. The moment he ended, Lena ran into the little passage and stood opposite the door. "I surrender," cried Curdie. "Then tie up your brute, and give her here." "No, no," cried Curdie through the door. "I surrender, but I'm not going to do your hangman's work. If you want my dog, you must take her." "Then we shall set the house on fire, and burn witch and all." "It will go hard with us, but we shall kill a few dozen of you first," cried Curdie. "We're not the least afraid of you." With that, Curdie turned to Durba and said, "Don't be frightened. I have a strong feeling that all will be well. Surely no trouble will come to you for being good to strangers." "But the poor dog," said Durba. Now Curdie and Lena understood each other more than a little by this time, and not only had he seen that she understood the proclamation, but when she looked up at him after it was read, it was with such a grin and such a yellow flash, that he saw also she was determined to take care of herself. "The dog will probably give you reason to think a little more of her ere long," he answered. "But now," he went on, "I fear I must hurt your house a little. I have great confidence, however, that I shall be able to make up to you for it one day." "Never mind the house, if only you can get safe off," she answered. "I don't think they will hurt this precious lamb," she added, clasping little Barbara to her bosom. "For myself, it is all one. I am ready for anything." "It is but a little hole for Lena I want to make," said Curdie. "She can creep through a much smaller one than you would think." Again he took his mattock and went to the back wall. "They won't burn the house," he said to himself. "There is too good a one on each side of it." The tumult had kept increasing every moment, and the city marshal had been shouting, but Curdie had not listened to him. When now they heard the blows of his mattock, there went up a great cry, and the people taunted the soldiers that they were afraid of a dog and his miner. The soldiers therefore made a rush at the door, and cut its fastenings. The moment they opened it, out leaped Lena with a roar so unnaturally horrible that the sword arms of the soldiers dropped by their sides, paralyzed with the terror of that cry. The crowd fled in every direction, shrieking and yelling with mortal dismay, and without even knocking down with her tail, not to say biting a man of them with her pulverizing jaws, Lena vanished, no one knew whither, for not one of the crowd had had courage to look upon her. The moment she was gone, Curdie advanced and gave himself up. The soldiers were so filled with fear, shame, and chagrin, that they were ready to kill him on the spot, but he stood quietly facing them, with his mattock on his shoulder, and the magistrate, wishing to examine him, and the people to see him made an example of, the soldiers had to content themselves with taking him. Partly for derision, partly to hurt him, they laid his mattock against his back, and tied his arms to it. They led him up a very steep street, and up another still, all the crowd following. The king's palace castle rose towering above them, but they stopped before they reached it, at a low-browed door in a great, dull, heavy-looking building. The city marshal opened it with a key which hung at his girdle, and ordered Curdie to enter. The place within was dark as night, and while he was feeling his way with his feet, the marshal gave him a rough push. He fell, and rolled once or twice over, unable to help himself because his hands were tied behind him. It was the hour of the magistrate's second and more important breakfast, and until that was over he never found himself capable of attending to a case with concentration sufficient to the distinguishing of the side upon which his own advantage lay, and hence was this respite for Curdie, with time to collect his thoughts. But indeed he had very few to collect, for all he had to do, so far as he could see, was to wait for what would come next. Neither had he much power to collect them, for he was a good deal shaken. In a few minutes he discovered, to his great relief, that from the projection of the pick-end of his mattock beyond his body, the fall had loosened the ropes tied round it. He got one hand disengaged, and then the other, and presently stood free, with his good mattock once more in right serviceable relation to his arms and legs. While the magistrate reinvigorated his selfishness with a greedy breakfast, Curdie found doing nothing in the dark rather wearisome work. It was useless attempting to think what he should do next, seeing the circumstances in which he was presently to find himself were altogether unknown to him. So he began to think about his father and mother in their little cottage home, high in the clear air of the open mountain-side, and the thought, instead of making his dungeon gloomier by contrast, made a light in his soul that destroyed the power of darkness and captivity. But he was at length startled from his waking dream by a swell in the noise outside. All the time there had been a few of the more idle of the inhabitants about the door, but they had been rather quiet. Now, however, the sounds of feet and voices began to grow, and grew so rapidly that it was plain a multitude was gathering. For the people of Gwynstorm always gave themselves an hour of pleasure after their second breakfast, and what greater pleasure could they have than to see a stranger abused by the officers of justice? The noise grew till it was like the roaring of the sea, and that roaring went on a long time, for the magistrate, being a great man, liked to know that he was waited for. It added to the enjoyment of his breakfast, and, indeed, enabled him to eat a little more after he had thought his powers exhausted. But at length, in the waves of the human noises, rose a bigger wave, and by the running and shouting and outcry, Curdie learned that the magistrate was approaching. Presently came the sound of a great rusty key in the lock, which yielded with groaning reluctance. The door was thrown back, the light rushed in, and with it came the voice of the city marshal, calling upon Curdie, by many legal epithets opprobrious, to come forth and be tried for his life, inasmuch as he had raised a tumult in his majesty's city of Gwynstorm, troubled the hearts of the king's baker and barber, and slain the faithful dogs of his majesty's well-beloved butchers. He was still reading, and Curdie was still seated in the brown twilight of the vault, not listening, but pondering with himself how this king the city marshal talked of could be the same with the majesty he had seen ride away on his grand white horse, with the Princess Irene on a cushion before him, when a scream of agonized terror arose on the farthest skirt of the crowd, and, swifter than flood or flame, the horror spread shrieking. In a moment the air was filled with hideous howling, cries of unspeakable dismay, and the multitudinous noise of running feet. The next moment, in at the door of the vault, bounded Lena, her 2 green eyes flaming yellow as sunflowers, and seeming to light up the dungeon. With one spring she threw herself at Curdie's feet, and laid her head upon them, panting. Then came a rush of 2 or 3 soldiers darkening the doorway, but it was only to lay hold of the key, pull the door to, and lock it, so that once more Curdie and Lena were prisoners together. For a few moments Lena lay panting hard. It is breathless work, leaping and roaring both at once, and that in a way to scatter thousands of people. Then she jumped up and began snuffing about all over the place, and Curdie saw what he had never seen before, 2 faint spots of light cast from her eyes upon the ground, one on each side of her snuffing nose. He got out his tinder box, a miner is never without one, and lighted a precious bit of candle he carried in a division of it, just for a moment, for he must not waste it. The light revealed a vault without any window or other opening than the door. It was very old and much neglected. The mortar had vanished from between the stones, and it was half filled with a heap of all sorts of rubbish, beaten down in the middle, but looser at the sides. It sloped from the door to the foot of the opposite wall. Evidently for a long time the vault had been left open, and every sort of refuse thrown into it. A single minute served for the survey, so little was there to note. Meantime, down in the angle between the back wall and the base of the heap, Lena was scratching furiously with all the 18 great strong claws of her mighty feet. "Aha!" said Curdie to himself, catching sight of her. "If only they will leave us long enough to ourselves." With that he ran to the door to see if there was any fastening on the inside. There was none. In all its long history it never had had one. But a few blows of the right sort, now from the one, now from the other end of his mattock, were as good as any bolt, for they so ruined the lock that no key could ever turn in it again. Those who heard them fancied he was trying to get out, and laughed spitefully. As soon as he had done, he extinguished his candle, and went down to Lena. She had reached the hard rock which formed the floor of the dungeon, and was now clearing away the earth a little wider. Presently she looked up in his face and whined, as much as to say, "My paws are not hard enough to get on any further." "Then get out of my way, Lena," said Curdie, "and mind you keep your eyes shining, for fear I should hit you." So saying, he heaved his mattock, and assailed with the hammer end of it the spot she had cleared. The rock was very hard, but when it did break, it broke in good-sized pieces. Now with hammer, now with pick, he worked till he was weary, then rested, and then set to again. He could not tell how the day went, as he had no light but the lamping of Lena's eyes. The darkness hampered him greatly, for he would not let Lena come close enough to give him all the light she could, lest he should strike her. So he had, every now and then, to feel with his hands to know how he was getting on, and to discover in what direction to strike. The exact spot was a mere imagination. He was getting very tired and hungry, and beginning to lose heart a little, when out of the ground, as if he had struck a spring of it, burst a dull, gleamy, lead-coloured light, and the next moment he heard a hollow splash and echo. A piece of rock had fallen out of the floor, and dropped into water beneath. Already Lena, who had been lying a few yards off all the time he worked, was on her feet and peering through the hole. Curdie got down on his hands and knees and looked. They were over what seemed a natural cave in the rock, to which apparently the river had access, for, at a great distance below, a faint light was gleaming upon water. If they could but reach it, they might get out, but even if it was deep enough, The height was very dangerous. The first thing, whatever might follow, was to make the hole larger. It was comparatively easy to break away the sides of it, and in the course of another hour he had it large enough to get through. And now he must reconnoitre. He took the rope they had tied him with, for Curdie's hindrances were always his furtherance, and fastened one end of it by a slip knot round the handle of his pickaxe, then dropped the other end through, and laid the pickaxe so that, when he was through himself, and hanging on to the edge, he could place it across the hole to support him on the rope. This done, he took the rope in his hands, and beginning to descend, found himself in a narrow cleft widening into a cave. His rope was not very long, and would not do much to lessen the force of his fall, he thought with himself, if he should have to drop into the water. But he was not more than a couple of yards below the dungeon when he spied an opening on the opposite side of the cleft. It might be but a shallow hole, or it might lead them out. He dropped himself a little below its level, gave the rope a swing by pushing his feet against the side of the cleft, and so penduled himself into it. Then he laid a stone on the end of the rope, that it should not forsake him, called to Lena, whose yellow eyes were gleaming over the mattock grating above, to watch there till he returned, and went cautiously in. It proved a passage, level for some distance, then sloping gently up. He advanced carefully, feeling his way as he went. At length he was stopped by a door, a small door, studded with iron. But the wood was in places so much decayed that some of the bolts had dropped out, and he felt sure of being able to open it. He returned, therefore, to fetch Lena and his mattock. Arrived at the cleft, his strong minor arms bore him swiftly up along the rope, and through the hole into the dungeon. There he undid the rope from his mattock, and making Lena take the end of it in her teeth, and get through the hole, he lowered her. It was all he could do, she was so heavy. When she came opposite the passage, with a slight push of her tail, she shot herself into it, and let go the rope, which Curdie drew up. Then he lighted his candle, and searching in the rubbish, found a bit of iron to take the place of his pickaxe across the hole. Then he searched again in the rubbish, and found half an old shutter. This he propped up, leaning a little over the hole, with a bit of stick, and heaped against the back of it a quantity of the loosened earth. Next he tied his mattock to the end of the rope, dropped it, and let it hang. Last he got through the hole himself, and pulled away the propping stick, so that the shutter fell over the hole, with a quantity of earth on the top of it. A few motions of hand over hand, and he swung himself and his mattock into the passage beside Lena. There he secured the end of the rope, and they went on together to the door. He lighted his candle and examined it. Decayed and broken as it was strongly secured in its place by hinges on the one side, and either lock or bolt, he could not tell which, on the other. A brief use of his pocket knife was enough to make room for his hand and arm to get through, and then he found a great iron bolt, but so rusty that he could not move it. Lena whimpered. He took his knife again, made the hole bigger, and stood back. In she shot her small head and long neck, seized the bolt with her teeth, and dragged it grating and complaining back. A push then opened the door. It was at the foot of a short flight of steps. They ascended, and at the top Curdie found himself in a space which, from the echo to his stamp, appeared of some size, though of what sort he could not at first tell, for his hands, feeling about, came upon nothing. Presently, however, they fell on a great thing. It was a wine cask. He was just setting out to explore the place by a thorough palpation, when he heard steps coming down a stair. He stood still, not knowing whether the door would open an inch from his nose or 20 yards behind his back. It did neither. He heard the key turn in the lock, and a stream of light shot in, ruining the darkness, about 15 yards away on his right. a man carrying a candle in one hand and a large silver flagon in the other entered and came towards him. The light revealed a row of huge wine casks that stretched away into the darkness of the other end of the long vault. Curdie retreated into the recess of the stair, and peeping round the corner of it, watched him, thinking what he could do to prevent him from locking them in. He came on, until Curdie feared he would pass the recess and see them. He was just preparing to rush out and master him before he should give alarm, not in the least knowing what he should do next, when, to his relief, the man stopped at the third cask from where he stood. He set down his light on the top of it, removed what seemed a large vent peg, and poured into the cask a quantity of something from the flagon. Then he turned to the next cask, drew some wine, rinsed the flagon, threw the wine away, drew and rinsed and threw away again, then drew and drank, draining to the bottom. Last of all, he filled the flagon from the cask he had first visited, replaced the vent peg, took up his candle, and turned towards the door. "There is something wrong here," thought Curdie. "Speak to him, Lena," he whispered. The sudden howl she gave made Curdie himself start and tremble for a moment. As to the man, he answered Lena's with another horrible howl, forced from him by the convulsive shudder of every muscle of his body, then reeled, gasping to and fro, and dropped his candle. But just as Curdie expected to see him fall dead, he recovered himself, and flew to the door, through which he darted, leaving it open behind him. The moment he ran, Curdie stepped out, picked up the candle still alight, sped after him to the door, drew out the key, and then returned to the stair and waited. In a few minutes he heard the sound of many feet and voices. Instantly he turned the tap of the cask from which the man had been drinking, set the candle beside it on the floor, went down the steps and out of the little door, followed by Lena, and closed it behind them. Through the hole in it he could see a little, and hear all. He could see how the light of many candles filled the place, and could hear how some 24 feet ran hither and thither through the echoing cellar. He could hear the clash of iron, probably spits and pokers, now and then, and at last heard how, finding nothing remarkable except the best wine running to waste, they all turned on the butler, and accused him of having fooled them with a drunken dream. He did his best to defend himself, appealing to the evidence of their own senses that he was as sober as they were. They replied that a fright was no less a fright, that the cause was imaginary, and a dream no less a dream, that the fright had waked him from it. When he discovered, and triumphantly adduced as corroboration, that the key was gone from the door, they said it merely showed how drunk he had been, either that or how frightened, for he had certainly dropped it. In vain he protested that he had never taken it out of the lock, that he never did when he went in, and certainly had not this time stopped to do so when he came out. They asked him why he had to go to the cellar at such a time of the day, and said it was because he had already drunk all the wine that was left from dinner. He said if he had dropped the key was to be found, and they must help him to find it. They told him they wouldn't move a peg for him. He declared, with much language, he would have them all turned out of the king's service. They said they would swear he was drunk, and so positive were they about it, that at last the butler himself began to think whether it was possible they could be in the right. For he knew that sometimes when he had been drunk, he fancied things had taken place which he found afterwards could not have happened. Certain of his fellow servants, however, had all the time a doubt whether the cellar goblin had not appeared to him, or at least roared at him, to protect the wine. In any case, nobody wanted to find the key for him. Nothing could please them better than that the door of the wine cellar should never more be locked. By degrees the hubbub died away, and they departed, not even pulling to the door, for there was neither handle nor latch to it. As soon as they were gone, Curdie returned, knowing now that they were in the wine cellar of the palace, as indeed he had suspected. Finding a pool of wine in the hollow of the floor, Lena lapped it up eagerly, She had had no breakfast, and was now very thirsty as well as hungry. Her master was in a similar plight, for he had but just begun to eat when the magistrate arrived with the soldiers. If only they were all in bed, he thought, that he might find his way to the larder, for he said to himself that, as he was sent there by the young princess's great-great-grandmother to serve her or her father in some way, surely he must have a right to his food in the palace, without which he could do nothing. He would go at once and reconnoitre. So he crept up the stair that led from the cellar. At the top was a door, opening on a long passage, dimly lighted by a lamp. He told Lena to lie down upon the stair while he went on. At the end of the passage he found a door ajar, and, peeping through, saw right into a great stone hall, where a huge fire was blazing, and through which men in the king's livery were constantly coming and going. Some also in the same livery were lounging about the fire. He noted that their colours were the same with those he himself, as king's miner, wore, but from what he had seen and heard of the habits of the place, he could not hope they would treat him the better for that. The one interesting thing at the moment, however, was the plentiful supper with which the table was spread. It was something, at least, to stand in sight of food, and he was unwilling to turn his back on the prospect, so long as a share in it was not absolutely hopeless. Peeping thus, he soon made up his mind that if at any moment the hall should be empty, he would at that moment rush in and attempt to carry off a dish. That he might lose no time by indecision, he selected a large pie upon which to pounce instantaneously. But after he had watched for some minutes, it did not seem at all likely the chance would arrive before supper time, and he was just about to turn away and rejoin Lena, when he saw that there was not a person in the place. Curdie never made up his mind and then hesitated. He darted in, seized the pie, and bore it swiftly and noiselessly to the cellar stair. Back to the cellar Curdie and Lena sped with their booty, where, seated on the steps, Curdie lighted his bit of candle for a moment. A very little bit it was now, but they did not waste much of it in examination of the pie. That they effected by a more summary process. Curdie thought it the nicest food he had ever tasted, and between them they soon ate it up. Then Curdie would have thrown the dish along with the bones into the water, that there might be no traces of them, but he thought of his mother and hid it instead, and the very next minute they wanted it to draw some wine into. He was careful it should be from the cask of which he had seen the butler drink. Then they sat down again on the steps and waited until the house should be quiet. For he was there to do something, and if it did not come to him in the cellar, he must go to meet it in other places. Therefore, lest he should fall asleep, he set the end of the helve of his mattock on the ground, and seated himself on the cross part, leaning against the wall, so that as long as he kept awake he should rest, but the moment he began to fall asleep, he must fall awake instead. He quite expected some of the servants would visit the cellar again that night, but whether it was that they were afraid of each other, or believed more of the butler's story than they had chosen to allow, not one of them appeared. When at length he thought he might venture, he shouldered his mattock and crept up the stair. The lamp was out in the passage, but he could not miss his way to the servants' hall. Trusting to Lena's quickness in concealing herself, he took her with him. When they reached the hall, they found it quiet and nearly dark. The last of the great fire was glowing red, but giving little light. Curdie stood and warmed himself for a few moments. Miner as he was, he had found the cellar cold to sit in, doing nothing, and standing thus, he thought of looking if there were any bits of candle about. There were many candlesticks on the supper table, but to his disappointment and indignation, their candles seemed to have all been left to burn out, and some of them, indeed, he found still hot in the neck. Presently, one after another, he came upon several men fast asleep, most of them upon tables, one in a chair, and one on the floor. They seemed from their shape and colour to have eaten and drunk so much that they might be burned alive without waking. He grasped the hand of each in succession, and found 2 ox hoofs, 3 pig hoofs, one concerning which he could not be sure whether it was the hoof of a donkey or a pony, and 1 dog's paw. A nice set of people to be about a king, thought Curdie to himself, and turned again to his candle hunt. He did at last find 2 or 3 little pieces, and stowed them away in his pockets. They now left the hall by another door, and entered a short passage, which led them to the huge kitchen, vaulted and black with smoke. There too the fire was still burning, so that he was able to see a little of the state of things in this quarter also. The place was dirty and disorderly. In a recess, on a heap of brushwood, lay a kitchen maid, with a table cover around her, and a skillet in her hand. Evidently she too had been drinking. In another corner lay a page, and Curdie noted how like his dress was to his own. In the cinders before the hearth were huddled 3 dogs and 5 cats, all fast asleep, while the rats were running about the floor. Curdie's heart ached to think of the lovely child princess living over such a sty. The mine was a paradise to a palace with such servants in it. Leaving the kitchen, he got into the region of the sculleries. There horrible smells were wandering about, like evil spirits that come forth with the darkness. He lighted a candle, but only to see ugly sights. Everywhere was filth and disorder. Mangy turnspit dogs were lying about, and grey rats were gnawing at refuse in the sinks. It was like a hideous dream. He felt as if he should never get out of it, and longed for one glimpse of his mother's poor little kitchen, so clean and bright and airy. Turning from it at last, in miserable disgust, he almost ran back through the kitchen, re-entered the hall, and crossed it to another door. It opened upon a wider passage, leading to an arch in a stately corridor, all its length lighted by lamps in niches. At the end of it was a large and beautiful hall, with great pillars. There sat 3 men in the royal livery, fast asleep, each in a great armchair, with his feet on a huge footstool. They looked like fools dreaming themselves kings, and Lena looked as if she longed to throttle them. At one side of the hall was the grand staircase, and they went up. Everything that now met Curdie's eyes was rich, not glorious like the splendors of the mountain cavern, but rich and soft, except where, now and then, some rough old rib of the ancient fortress came through, hard and discolored. Now some dark bare arch of stone, now some rugged and blackened pillar, now some huge beam, brown with the smoke and dust of centuries, looked like a thistle in the midst of daisies, or a rock in a smooth lawn. They wandered about a good while, again and again finding themselves where they had been before. Gradually, however, Curdie was gaining some idea of the place. By and by Lena began to look frightened, and as they went on, Curdie saw that she looked more and more frightened. Now, by this time he had come to understand that what made her look frightened was always the fear of frightening, and he therefore concluded they must be drawing nigh to somebody. At last, in a gorgeously painted gallery, he saw a curtain of crimson, and on the curtain a royal crown wrought in silks and stones. He felt sure this must be the king's chamber, and it was here he was wanted, or, if it was not the place he was bound for, something would meet him and turn him aside. For he had come to think that so long as a man wants to do right, he may go where he can. When he can go no further, then it is not the way. Only, said his father, in assenting to the theory, he must really want to do right, and not merely fancy he does. He must want it with his heart and will, and not with his rag of a tongue. So he gently lifted the corner of the curtain, and there behind it was a half-open door. He entered, and the moment he was in, Lena stretched herself along the threshold, between the curtain and the door. He found himself in a large room, dimly lighted by a silver lamp that hung from the ceiling. Far at the other end was a great bed, surrounded with dark, heavy curtains. He went softly towards it, his heart beating fast. It was a dreadful thing to be alone in the king's chamber at the dead of night. To gain courage, he had to remind himself of the beautiful princess who had sent him. But when he was about halfway to the bed, a figure appeared from the farther side of it, and came towards him, with a hand raised warningly. He stood still. The light was dim, and he could distinguish little more than the outline of a young girl. But though the form he saw was much taller than the princess he remembered, he never doubted it was she. For one thing, he knew that most girls would have been frightened to see him there in the dead of the night, but like a true princess, and the princess he used to know, she walked straight on to meet him. And as she came, she lowered the hand she had lifted, and laid the forefinger of it upon her lips. Nearer and nearer, quite near, close up to him she came, then stopped, and stood a moment, looking at him. "You are Curdie," she said. "And you are the Princess Irene," he returned. "Then we know each other still," she said, with a sad smile of pleasure. "You will help me." "That I will," answered Curdie. He did not say, "if I can," for he knew that what he was sent to do, that he could do. "May I kiss your hand, little princess?" She was only between 9 and 10, though indeed she looked several years older, and her eyes almost those of a grown woman, for she had had terrible trouble of late. She held out her hand. "I am not the little princess any more. I have grown up since I saw you last, Mr. Miner." The smile which accompanied the words had in it a strange mixture of playfulness and sadness. "So I see, Miss Princess," returned Curdie, "and therefore, being more of a princess, you are the more my princess. Here I am, sent by your great-great-grandmother to be your servant. May I ask why you are up so late, princess?" "Because my father wakes so frightened, and I don't know what he would do if he didn't find me by his bedside. There, he's waking now." She darted off to the side of the bed she had come from. Curdie stood where he was. A voice altogether unlike what he remembered of the mighty, noble king on his white horse came from the bed, thin, feeble, hollow and husky, and in a tone like that of a petulant child. "I will not! I will not! I am a king, and I will be a king. I hate you and despise you, and you shall not torture me." "Never mind them, father dear," said the princess. "I am here, and they shan't touch you. They dare not, you know, so long as you defy them." "They want my crown, darling, and I can't give them my crown, can I? For what is a king without his crown?" "They shall never have your crown, my king," said Irene. "Here it is, all safe, you see. I am watching it for you." Curdie drew near the bed on the other side. There lay the grand old king. He looked grand still, and 20 years older. His body was pillowed high, his beard descended long and white over the crimson coverlid, and his crown, its diamonds and emeralds gleaming in the twilight of the curtains, lay in front of him, his long, thin old hands folded round the regal, and the ends of his beard straying among the lovely stones. His face was like that of a man who had died fighting nobly, but one thing made it dreadful. His eyes, while they moved about as if searching in this direction and in that, looked more dead than his face. He saw neither his daughter nor his crown. It was the voice of the one and the touch of the other that comforted him. He kept murmuring what seemed words, but was unintelligible to Curdie, although, to judge from the look of Irene's face, she learned and concluded from it. By degrees his voice sank away, and the murmuring ceased, although still his lips moved. Thus lay the old king on his bed, slumbering with his crown between his hands. On one side of him stood a lovely little maiden with blue eyes and brown hair going a little back from her temples, as if blown by a wind that no one felt but herself. And on the other, a stalwart young miner with his mattock over his shoulder. Stranger sight still was Lena lying along the threshold, only nobody saw her just then. A moment more, and the king's lips ceased to move. His breathing had grown regular and quiet. The princess gave a sigh of relief, and came round to Curdie. "We can talk a little now," she said, leading him towards the middle of the room. "My father will sleep now till the doctor wakes him to give him his medicine. It is not really medicine, though, but wine. Nothing but that, the doctor says, could have kept him so long alive. He always comes in the middle of the night to give it to him with his own hands, but it makes me cry to see him waked up when so nicely asleep." "What sort of man is your doctor?" asked Curdie. "Oh, such a dear, good, kind gentleman," replied the princess. "He speaks so softly, and is so sorry for his dear king. He will be here presently, and you shall see for yourself. You will like him very much." "Has your king father been long ill?" asked Curdie. "A whole year now," she replied. "Did you not know? That's how your mother never got the red petticoat my father promised her. The Lord Chancellor told me that not only Gwynstorm, but the whole land was mourning over the illness of the good man." Now Curdie himself had not heard a word of his Majesty's illness, and had no ground for believing that a single soul in any place he had visited on his journey had heard of it. Moreover, although mention had been made of his Majesty again and again in his hearing since he came to Gwynstorm, never once had he heard an allusion to the state of his health. And now it dawned upon him also that he had never heard the least expression of love to him. But just for the time he thought it better to say nothing on either point. "Does the king wander like this every night?" he asked. "Every night," answered Irene, shaking her head mournfully. "That is why I never go to bed at night. He is better during the day, a little, and then I sleep in the dressing room there, to be with him in a moment if he should call me. It is so sad he should have only me, and not my mamma. A princess is nothing to a queen." "I wish he would like me," said Curdie, "for then I might watch by him at night, and let you go to bed, princess." "Don't you know then?" returned Irene in wonder. "How was it you came? Ah, you said my grandmother sent you. But I thought you knew that he wanted you." And again she opened wide her blue stars. "Not I," said Curdie, also bewildered, but very glad. "He used to be constantly saying, he was not so ill then as he is now, that he wished he had you about him." "And I never to know it!" said Curdie, with displeasure. "The master of the horse told papa's own secretary that he had written to the minor general to find you and send you up. But the minor general wrote back to the master of the horse, and he told the secretary, and the secretary told my father, that they had searched every mine in the kingdom, and could hear nothing of you. My father gave a great sigh, and said he feared the goblins had got you after all, and your father and mother were dead of grief. And he has never mentioned you since, except when wandering. I cried very much, but one of my grandmother's pigeons with its white wing flashed a message to me through the window one day, and then I knew that my Curdie wasn't eaten by the goblins, for my grandmother wouldn't have taken care of him one time to let him be eaten the next. Where were you, Curdie, that they couldn't find you?" "We will talk about that another time, when we are not expecting the doctor," said Curdie. As he spoke, his eyes fell upon something shining on the table under the lamp. His heart gave a great throb, and he went nearer. Yes, there could be no doubt. It was the same flagon that the butler had filled in the wine cellar. "It looks worse and worse," he said to himself, and went back to Irene, where she stood, half dreaming. "When will the doctor be here?" he asked once more, this time hurriedly. The question was answered, not by the princess, but by something which that instant tumbled heavily into the room. Curdie flew towards it in vague terror about Lena. On the floor lay a little round man, puffing and blowing, and uttering incoherent language. Curdie thought of his mattock, and ran and laid it aside. "Oh, dear Dr. Kelman!" cried the princess, running up and taking hold of his arm. "I am so sorry!" She pulled and pulled, but might almost as well have tried to set up a cannon-ball. "I hope you have not hurt yourself." "Not at all, not at all," said the doctor, trying to smile and to rise both at once, but finding it impossible to do either. "If he slept on the floor he would be late for breakfast," said Curdie to himself, and held out his hand to help him. But when he took hold of it, Curdie very nearly let him fall again, for what he held was not even a foot. It was the belly of a creeping thing. He managed, however, to hold both his peace and his grasp, and pulled the doctor roughly on his legs, such as they were. "Your Royal Highness has rather a thick mat at the door," said the doctor, patting his palms together. "I hope my awkwardness may not have startled his majesty." While he talked, Curdie went to the door. Lena was not there. The doctor approached the bed. "And how has my beloved king slept tonight?" he asked. "No better," answered Irene, with a mournful shake of her head. "Ah, that is very well," returned the doctor, his fall seeming to have muddled either his words or his meaning. "We must give him his wine, and then he will be better still." Curdie darted at the flagon, and lifted it high, as if he had expected to find it full, but had found it empty. "That stupid butler! I heard them say he was drunk!" he cried in a loud whisper, and was gliding from the room. "Come here with that flagon, you! Page!" cried the doctor. Curdie came a few steps towards him, with the flagon dangling from his hand, heedless of the gushes that fell noiseless on the thick carpet. "Are you aware, young man," said the doctor, "that it is not every wine can do his majesty the benefit I intend he should derive from my prescription?" "Quite aware, sir," answered Curdie. "The wine for his majesty's use is in the third cask from the corner." "Fly, then," said the doctor, looking satisfied. Curdie stopped outside the curtain, and blew an audible breath, no more. Up came Lena, noiseless as a shadow. He showed her the flagon. "The cellar, Lena. Go," he said. She galloped away on her soft feet, and Curdie had indeed to fly to keep up with her. Not once did she make even a dubious turn. From the king's gorgeous chamber to the cold cellar they shot. Curdie dashed the wine down the back stair, rinsed the flagon out as he had seen the butler do, filled it from the cask of which he had seen the butler drink, and hastened with it up again to the king's room. The little doctor took it, poured out a full glass, smelt, but did not taste it, and set it down. Then he leaned over the bed, shouted in the king's ear, blew upon his eyes, and pinched his arm. Curdie thought he saw him run something bright into it. At last the king half woke. The doctor seized the glass, raised his head, poured the wine down his throat, and let his head fall back on the pillow again. Tenderly wiping his beard, and bidding the princess good night in paternal tones, he then took his leave. Curdie would gladly have driven his pick into his head, but that was not in his commission, and he let him go. The little round man looked very carefully to his feet as he crossed the threshold. "That attentive fellow of a page has removed the mat," he said to himself as he walked along the corridor. "I must remember him." Curdie was already sufficiently enlightened as to how things were going, to see that he must have the princess of one mind with him, and they must work together. It was clear that amongst those about the king there was a plot against him. For one thing, they had agreed in a lie concerning himself, and it was plain also that the doctor was working out a design against the health and reason of his majesty, rendering the question of his life a matter of little moment. It was in itself sufficient to justify the worst fears, that the people outside the palace were ignorant of his majesty's condition. He believed those inside it also, the butler excepted, were ignorant of it as well. Doubtless his majesty's counsellors desired to alienate the hearts of his subjects from their sovereign. Curdie's idea was that they intended to kill the king, marry the princess to one of themselves, and found a new dynasty. But whatever their purpose, there was treason in the palace of the worst sort. They were making and keeping the king incapable in order to effect that purpose. The first thing to be seen to, therefore, was, that his majesty should neither eat morsel nor drink drop of anything prepared for him in the palace. Could this have been managed without the princess, Curdie would have preferred leaving her in ignorance of the horrors from which he sought to deliver her. He feared also the danger of her knowledge betraying itself to the evil eyes about her, but it must be risked, and she had always been a wise child. Another thing was clear to him, that with such traitors no terms of honour were either binding or possible, and that, short of lying, he might use any means to foil them. And he could not doubt that the old princess had sent him expressly to frustrate their plans. While he stood thinking thus with himself, the princess was earnestly watching the king, with looks of childish love and womanly tenderness that went to Curdie's heart. Now and then, with a great fan of peacock feathers, she would fan him very softly. Now and then, seeing a cloud beginning to gather upon the sky of his sleeping face, she would climb upon the bed, and bending to his ear, whisper into it, then draw back and watch again, generally to see the cloud disperse. In his deepest slumber the soul of the king lay open to the voice of his child, and that voice had power either to change the aspect of his visions, or, which was better still, to breathe hope into his heart, and courage to endure them. Curdie came near, and softly called her. "I can't leave papa just yet," she returned, in a low voice. "I will wait," said Curdie, "but I want very much to say something." In a few minutes she came to him where he stood under the lamp. "Well, Curdie, what is it?" she said. "Princess," he replied, "I want to tell you that I have found why your grandmother sent me." "Come this way, then," she answered, "where I can see the face of my king." Curdie placed a chair for her in the spot she chose, where she would be near enough to mark any slightest change on her father's countenance, yet where their low-voiced talk would not disturb him. There he sat down beside her, and told her all the story, how her grandmother had sent her good pigeon for him, and how she had instructed him, and sent him there without telling him what he had to do. Then he told her what he had discovered of the state of things generally in Gwyntystorm, and specially what he had heard and seen in the palace that night. "Things are in a bad state enough," he said in conclusion. "Lying and selfishness, and inhospitality and dishonesty everywhere, and to crown it all, they speak with disrespect of the good king, and not a man of them knows he is ill." "You frighten me dreadfully," said Irene, trembling. "You must be brave for your king's sake," said Curdie. "Indeed I will," she replied, and turned a long, loving look upon the beautiful face of her father. "But what is to be done? And how am I to believe such horrible things of Dr. Kelman?" "My dear princess," replied Curdie, "you know nothing of him but his face and his tongue, and they are both false. Either you must beware of him, or you must doubt your grandmother and me, for I tell you, by the gift she gave me of testing hands, that this man is a snake. That round body he shows is but the case of a serpent. Perhaps the creature lies there, as in its nest, coiled round and round inside." "Horrible!" said Irene. "Horrible indeed, but we must not try to get rid of horrible things by refusing to look at them, and saying they are not there. Is not your beautiful father sleeping better since he had the wine?" "Yes." "Does he always sleep better after having it?" She reflected an instant. "No, always worse till tonight," she answered. "Then remember, that was the wine I got him, not what the butler drew. Nothing that passes through any hand in the house except yours or mine must henceforth, till he is well, reach his majesty's lips." "But how, dear Curdie?" said the princess, almost crying. "That we must contrive," answered Curdie. "I know how to take care of the wine, but for his food, now we must think." "He takes hardly any," said the princess, with a pathetic shake of her little head, which Curdie had almost learned to look for. the more need," he replied, "there should be no poison in it." Irene shuddered. "As soon as he has honest food, he will begin to grow better. And you must be just as careful with yourself, princess," Curdie went on, "for you don't know when they may begin to poison you too." "There's no fear of me. Don't talk about me," said Irene. "The good food. How are we to get it, Curdie? That is the whole question." "I am thinking hard," answered Curdie. "The good food. Let me see. Such servants as I saw below are sure to have the best of everything for themselves. I will go and see what I can find on their supper table." "The chancellor sleeps in the house, and he and the master of the king's horse always have their supper together in a room off the great hall, to the right as you go down the stair," said Irene. "I would go with you, but I dare not leave my father. Alas, he scarcely ever takes more than a mouthful. I can't think how he lives. And the very thing he would like, and often asks for, a bit of bread, I can hardly ever get for him. Dr. Kelman has forbidden it, and says it is nothing less than poison to him." "Bread at least he shall have," said Curdie, "and that, with the honest wine, will do as well as anything, I do believe. I will go at once and look for some. But I want you to see Lena first, and know her, lest, coming upon her by accident at any time, you should be frightened." "I should like much to see her," said the princess. Warning her not to be startled by her ugliness, he went to the door and called her. She entered, creeping with downcast head, and dragging her tail over the floor behind her. Curdie watched the princess as the frightful creature came nearer and nearer. One shudder went from head to foot of her, and next instant she stepped to meet her. Lena dropped flat on the floor and covered her face with her two big paws. It went to the heart of the princess. In a moment she was on her knees beside her, stroking her ugly head and patting her all over. "Good dog! Dear ugly dog!" she said. Lena whimpered. "I believe," said Curdie, "from what your grandmother told me, that Lena is a woman, and that she was naughty, but is now growing good." Lena had lifted her head while Irene was caressing her. Now she dropped it again between her paws, but the princess took it in her hands and kissed the forehead betwixt the gold-green eyes. "Shall I take her with me, or leave her?" asked Curdie. "Leave her, poor dear," said Irene, and Curdie, knowing the way now, went without her. He took his way first to the room the princess had spoken of, and there also were the remains of supper, but neither there nor in the kitchen could he find a scrap of plain, wholesome-looking bread. So he returned and told her that as soon as it was light he would go into the city for some, and asked her for a handkerchief to tie it in. If he could not bring it himself, he would send it by Lena, who could keep out of sight better than he, and as soon as all was quiet at night, he would come to her again. He also asked her to tell the king that he was in the house. His hope lay in the fact that bakers everywhere go to work early, but it was yet much too early, so he persuaded the princess to lie down, promising to call her if the king should stir. His Majesty slept very quietly. The dawn had grown almost day, and still Curdie lingered, unwilling to disturb the princess. At last, however, he called her, and she was in the room in a moment. She had slept, she said, and felt quite fresh. Delighted to find her father still asleep, and so peacefully, she pushed her chair close to the bed, and sat down with her hands in her lap. Curdie got his mattock from where he had hidden it behind a great mirror, and went to the cellar, followed by Lena. They took some breakfast with them as they passed through the hall, and as soon as they had eaten it, went out the back way. At the mouth of the passage, Curdie seized the rope, drew himself up, pushed away the shutter, and entered the dungeon. Then he swung the end of the rope to Lena, and she caught it in her teeth. When her master said, "Now, Lena," she gave a great spring, and he ran away with the end of the rope as fast as ever he could. And such a spring had she made that by the time he had to bear her weight, she was within a few feet of the hole. The instant she got a paw through, she was all through. Apparently their enemies were waiting till hunger should have cowed them, for there was no sign of any attempt having been made to open the door. A blow or two of Curdie's mattock drove the shattered lock clean from it, and telling Lena to wait there till he came back, and let no one in, he walked out into the silent street, and drew the door to behind him. He could hardly believe it was not yet a whole day since he had been thrown in there with his hands tied at his back. Down the town he went, walking in the middle of the street, that, if anyone saw him, he might see he was not afraid, and hesitate to rouse an attack on him. As to the dogs, ever since the death of their two companions, a shadow that looked like a mattock was enough to make them scamper. As soon as he reached the archway of the city gate, he turned to reconnoitre the baker's shop, and perceiving no sign of movement, waited there watching for the first. After about an hour the door opened, and the baker's man appeared with a pail in his hand. He went to a pump that stood in the street, and having filled his pail, returned with it into the shop. Curdie stole after him, found the door on the latch, opened it very gently, peeped in, saw nobody, and entered. Remembering perfectly from what shelf the baker's wife had taken the loaf she said was the best, and seeing just one upon it, he seized it, laid the price of it on the counter, and sped softly out and up the street. Once more in the dungeon beside Lena, his first thought was to fasten up the door again, which would have been easy, so many iron fragments of all sorts and sizes lay about. But he bethought himself that, if he left it as it was, and they came to find him, they would conclude at once that they had made their escape by it, and would look no further so as to discover the hole. He therefore merely pushed the door close and left it. Then once more carefully arranging the earth behind the shutter, so that it should again fall with it, he returned to the cellar. And now he had to convey the loaf to the princess. If he could venture to take it himself, well; if not, he would send Lena. He crept to the door of the servants' hall, and found the sleepers beginning to stir. One said it was time to go to bed, another that he would go to the cellar instead, and have a mug of wine to waken him up, while a third challenged a fourth to give him his revenge at some game or other. "Oh, hang your losses!" answered his companion. "You'll soon pick up twice as much about the house, if you but keep your eyes open." Perceiving there would be risk in attempting to pass through, and reflecting that the porters in the great hall would probably be awake also, Curdie went back to the cellar, took Irene's handkerchief with the loaf in it, tied it round Lena's neck, and told her to take it to the princess. Using every shadow and every shelter, Lena slid through the servants like a shapeless terror through a guilty mind, and so, by corridor and great hall, up the stairs to the king's chamber. Irene trembled a little when she saw her glide soundless in across the silent dusk of the morning that filtered through the heavy drapery of the windows, but she recovered herself at once when she saw the bundle about her neck, for it both assured her of Curdie's safety and gave her hope of her father's. She untied it with joy, and Lena stole away, silent as she had come. Her joy was the greater that the king had woke up a little while before and expressed a desire for food. Not that he felt exactly hungry, he said, and yet he wanted something. If only he might have a piece of nice fresh bread. Irene had no knife, but with eager hands she broke a great piece from the loaf, and poured out a full glass of wine. The king ate and drank, enjoyed the bread and the wine much, and instantly fell asleep again. It was hours before the lazy people brought their breakfast. When it came, Irene crumbled a little about, threw some into the fireplace, and managed to make the tray look just as usual. In the meantime, down below in the cellar, Curdie was lying in the hollow between the upper sides of two of the great casks, the warmest place he could find. Lena was watching. She lay at his feet across the two casks, and did her best so to arrange her huge tail that it should be a warm coverlid for her master. By and by Dr. Kelman called to see his patient, and now that Irene's eyes were opened, she saw clearly enough that he was both annoyed and puzzled at finding his majesty rather better. He pretended, however, to congratulate him, saying he believed he was quite fit to see the Lord Chamberlain. He wanted his signature to something important, only he must not strain his mind to understand it, whatever it might be. If his Majesty did, he would not be answerable for the consequences. The king said he would see the Lord Chamberlain, and the doctor went. Then Irene gave him more bread and wine, and the king ate and drank, and smiled a feeble smile, the first real one she had seen for many a day. He said he felt much better, and would soon be able to take matters into his own hands again. He had a strange, miserable feeling, he said, that things were going terribly wrong, although he could not tell how. Then the princess told him that Curdie was come, and that at night, when all was quiet, for nobody in the palace must know, he would pay his Majesty a visit. At noon the Lord Chamberlain appeared. With a long, low bow, and paper in hand, he stepped softly into the room. Greeting his Majesty with every appearance of the profoundest respect, and congratulating him on the evident progress he had made, he declared himself sorry to trouble him, but there were certain papers, he said, which required his signature, and therewith drew nearer to the king, who lay looking at him doubtfully. He was a lean, long, yellow man, with a small head, bald over the top, and tufted at the back and about the ears. He had a very thin, prominent, hooked nose, and a quantity of loose skin under his chin and about the throat, which came craning up out of his neckcloth. His eyes were very small, sharp, and glittering, and looked black as jet. He had hardly enough of a mouth to make a smile with. His left hand held the paper, and the long, skinny fingers of his right a pen just dipped in ink. But the king, who for weeks had scarcely known what he did, was to-day so much himself as to be aware that he was not quite himself. And the moment he saw the paper, he resolved that he would not sign without understanding and approving of it. He requested the Lord Chamberlain therefore to read it. His lordship commenced at once, but the difficulties he seemed to encounter, and the fits of stammering that seized him, roused the king's suspicion tenfold. He called the princess. "I trouble his lordship too much," he said to her. "You can read print well, my child. Let me hear how you can read writing. Take that paper from his lordship's hand, and read it to me from beginning to end, while my lord drinks a glass of my favourite wine, and watches for your blunders." "Pardon me, your Majesty," said the Lord Chamberlain, with as much of a smile as he was able to extemporize, "but it were 1,000 pities to put the attainments of her Royal Highness to a test altogether too severe. Your Majesty can scarcely with justice expect the very organs of her speech to prove capable of compassing words so long, and to her so unintelligible." "I think much of my little princess and her capabilities," returned the king, more and more aroused. "Pray, my lord, permit her to try." "Consider, your Majesty, the thing would be altogether without precedent. It would be to make sport of statecraft," said the Lord Chamberlain. "Perhaps you are right, my lord," answered the king, with more meaning than he intended should be manifest, while to his growing joy he felt new life and power throbbing in heart and brain. "So this morning we shall read no farther. I am indeed ill able for business of such weight." "Will your Majesty please sign your royal name here?" said the Lord Chamberlain, preferring the request as a matter of course, and approaching with the feather end of the pen pointed to a spot where was a great red seal. "Not to-day, my lord," replied the king. "It is of the greatest importance, your Majesty," softly insisted the other. "I descried no such importance in it," said the king. "Your Majesty heard but a part." "And I can hear no more to-day." "I trust your Majesty has ground enough, in a case of necessity like the present, to sign upon the representation of his loyal subject and chamberlain. Or shall I call the Lord Chancellor?" he added, rising. "There is no need. I have the very highest opinion of your judgment, my lord," answered the king. "That is, with respect to means. We might differ as to ends." the Lord Chamberlain made yet further attempts at persuasion, but they grew feebler and feebler, and he was at last compelled to retire without having gained his object. And well might his annoyance be keen, for that paper was the king's will, drawn up by the Attorney General, nor until they had the king's signature to it was there much use in venturing farther. But his worst sense of discomfiture arose from finding the king with so much capacity left, for the doctor had pledged himself so to weaken his brain that he should be as a child in their hands, incapable of refusing anything requested of him. His lordship began to doubt the doctor's fidelity to the conspiracy. The princess was in high delight. She had not for weeks heard so many words, not to say words of such strength and reason, from her father's lips. Day by day he had been growing weaker and more lethargic. He was so much exhausted, however, after this effort, that he asked for another piece of bread and more wine, and fell fast asleep the moment he had taken them. The Lord Chamberlain sent in a rage for Dr. Kelman. He came, and while professing himself unable to understand the symptoms described by his lordship, yet pledged himself again that on the morrow the king should do whatever was required of him. The day went on. When his majesty was awake, the princess read to him, one story-book after another, and whatever she read, the king listened as if he had never heard anything so good before, making out in it the wisest meanings. Every now and then he asked for a piece of bread and a little wine, and every time he ate and drank, he slept, and every time he woke, he seemed better than the last time. The princess bearing her part, the loaf was eaten up and the flagon emptied before night. The butler took the flagon away and brought it back filled to the brim, but both were thirsty as well as hungry when Curdie came again. Meantime, he and Lena, watching and waking alternately, had plenty of sleep. In the afternoon, peeping from the recess, they saw several of the servants enter hurriedly, one after the other, draw wine, drink it, and steal out. But their business was to take care of the king, not of his cellar, and they let them drink. Also, when the butler came to fill the flagon, they restrained themselves, for the villain's fate was not yet ready for him. He looked terribly frightened, and had brought with him a large candle and a small terrier, which latter indeed threatened to be troublesome, for he went roving and sniffing about until he came to the recess where they were. But as soon as he showed himself, Lena opened her jaws so wide and glared at him so horribly that, without even uttering a whimper, he tucked his tail between his legs and ran to his master. He was drawing the wicked wine at the moment, and did not see him, else he would doubtless have run too. When supper time approached, Curdie took his place at the door into the servants' hall, but after a long hour's vain watch, he began to fear he should get nothing. There was so much idling about, as well as coming and going. It was hard to bear, chiefly from the attractions of a splendid loaf, just fresh out of the oven, which he longed to secure for the king and princess. At length his chance did arrive. He pounced upon the loaf and carried it away, and soon after got hold of a pie. This time, however, both loaf and pie were missed. The cook was called. He declared he had provided both. One of themselves, he said, must have carried them away for some friend outside the palace. Then a housemaid, who had not long been one of them, said she had seen someone like a page running in the direction of the cellar, with something in his hands. Instantly all turned upon the pages, accusing them one after another. All denied, but nobody believed one of them. Where there is no truth, there can be no faith. To the cellar they all set out to look for the missing pie and loaf. Lena heard them coming, as well she might, for they were talking and quarrelling loud, and gave her master warning. They snatched up everything, and got all signs of their presence out at the back door, before the servants entered. When they found nothing, they all turned on the chambermaid, and accused her, not only of lying against the pages, but of having taken the things herself. Their language and behaviour so disgusted Curdie, who could hear a great part of what passed, and he saw the danger of discovery now so much increased, that he began to devise how best at once to rid the palace of the whole pack of them. That, however, would be small gain, so long as the treacherous officers of state continued in it. They must be first dealt with. A thought came to him, and the longer he looked at it, the better he liked it. As soon as the servants were gone, quarrelling and accusing all the way, they returned and finished their supper. Then Curdie, who had long been satisfied that Lena understood almost every word he said, communicated his plan to her, and knew by the wagging of her tail and the flashing of her eyes that she comprehended it. Until they had the king safe through the worst part of the night, however, nothing could be done. They had now merely to go on waiting where they were till the household should be asleep. This waiting and waiting was much the hardest thing Curdie had to do in the whole affair. He took his mattock, and going again into the long passage, lighted a candle end, and proceeded to examine the rock on all sides. But this was not merely to pass the time. He had a reason for it. When he broke the stone in the street over which the baker fell, its appearance led him to pocket a fragment for further examination, and since then he had satisfied himself that it was the kind of stone in which gold is found, and that the yellow particles in it were pure metal. If such stone existed here in any plenty, he could soon make the king rich and independent of his ill-conditioned subjects. He was therefore now bent on an examination of the rock, nor had he been at it long before he was persuaded that there were large quantities of gold in the half-crystalline white stone, with its veins of opaque white and of green, of which the rock, so far as he had been able to inspect it, seemed almost entirely to consist. Every piece he broke was spotted with particles and little lumps of a lovely greenish yellow, and that was gold. Hitherto he had worked only in silver, but he had read and heard talk, and knew therefore about gold. As soon as he had got the king free of rogues and villains, he would have all the best and most honest miners, with his father at the head of them, to work this rock for the king. It was a great delight to him to use his mattock once more. The time went quickly, and when he left the passage to go to the king's chamber, he had already a good heap of fragments behind the broken door. As soon as he had reason to hope the way was clear, Curdie ventured softly into the hall, with Lena behind him. There was no one asleep on the bench or floor, but by the fading fire sat a girl weeping. It was the same who had seen him carrying off the food, and had been so hardly used for saying so. She opened her eyes when he appeared, but did not seem frightened at him. "I know why you weep," said Curdie, "and I am sorry for you." "It is hard not to be believed just because one speaks the truth," said the girl, "but that seems reason enough with some people. My mother taught me to speak the truth, and took such pains with me that I should find it hard to tell a lie, though I could invent many a story these servants would believe at once, for the truth is a strange thing here, and they don't know it when they see it. Show it them, and they all stare as if it were a wicked lie, and that with the lie yet warm that has just left their own mouths. You are a stranger," she said, and burst out weeping afresh, "but the stranger you are to such a place and such people, the better." "I am the person," said Curdie, "whom you saw carrying the things from the supper table." He showed her the loaf. "If you can trust as well as speak the truth, I will trust you. Can you trust me?" She looked at him steadily for a moment. "I can," she answered. "One thing more," said Curdie. "Have you courage as well as faith?" "I think so." "Look my dog in the face, and don't cry out. Come here, Lena." Lena obeyed. The girl looked at her, and laid her hand on her head. "Now I know you are a true woman," said Curdie. "I am come to set things right in this house. Not one of the servants knows I am here. Will you tell them tomorrow morning that, if they do not alter their ways, and give over drinking and lying and stealing and unkindness, they shall every one of them be driven from the palace?" "They will not believe me." "Most likely. But will you give them the chance?" "I will." "Then I will be your friend. Wait here till I come again." She looked him once more in the face, and sat down. When he reached the royal chamber, he found his majesty awake, and very anxiously expecting him. He received him with the utmost kindness, and at once, as it were, put himself in his hands by telling him all he knew concerning the state he was in. His voice was feeble, but his eye was clear, and although now and then his words and thoughts seemed to wander, Curdie could not be certain that the cause of their not being intelligible to him did not lie in himself. The king told him that for some years, ever since his queen's death, he had been losing heart over the wickedness of his people. He had tried hard to make them good, but they got worse and worse. Evil teachers, unknown to him, had crept into the schools, and there was a general decay of truth and right principle, at least in the city, and as that set the example to the nation, it must spread. The main cause of his illness was the despondency with which the degeneration of his people affected him. He could not sleep, and had terrible dreams, while, to his unspeakable shame and distress, he doubted almost everybody. He had striven against his suspicion, but in vain, and his heart was sore, for his courtiers and counsellors were really kind, only he could not think why none of their ladies came near his princess. The whole country was discontented, he heard, and there were signs of gathering storm outside as well as inside his borders. The master of the horse gave him sad news of the insubordination of the army, and his great white horse was dead, they told him, and his sword had lost its temper. It bent double the last time he tried it, only perhaps that was in a dream, and they could not find his shield, and one of his spurs had lost the rowel. Thus the poor king went wandering in a maze of sorrows, some of which were purely imaginary, while others were truer than he understood. He told how thieves came at night and tried to take his crown, so that he never dared let it out of his hands, even when he slept, and how every night an evil demon in the shape of his physician came and poured poison down his throat. He knew it to be poison, he said, somehow, although it tasted like wine. Here he stopped, faint with the unusual exertion of talking. Curdie seized the flagon and ran to the wine cellar. In the servants' hall the girl still sat by the fire, waiting for him. As he returned, he told her to follow him, and left her at the chamber door till he should rejoin her. When the king had had a little wine, he informed him that he had already discovered certain of his majesty's enemies, and one of the worst of them was the doctor, for it was no other demon than the doctor himself who had been coming every night and giving him a slow poison. "So," said the king, "then I have not been suspicious enough, for I thought it was but a dream. Is it possible Kelman can be such a wretch? Who then am I to trust?" "Not one in the house, except the princess and myself," said Curdie. "I will not go to sleep," said the king. "That would be as bad as taking the poison," said Curdie. "No, no, sire. You must show your confidence by leaving all the watching to me, and doing all the sleeping your majesty can." The king smiled a contented smile, turned on his side, and was presently fast asleep. Then Curdie persuaded the princess also to go to sleep, and telling Lena to watch, went to the housemaid. He asked her if she could inform him which of the council slept in the palace, and show him their rooms. She knew every one of them, she said, and took him the round of all their doors, telling him which slept in each room. He then dismissed her, and returning to the king's chamber, seated himself behind a curtain at the head of the bed, on the side farthest from the king. He told Lena to get under the bed, and make no noise. About 1 o'clock the doctor came stealing in. He looked round for the princess, and seeing no one, smiled with satisfaction as he approached the wine where it stood under the lamp. Having partly filled a glass, he took from his pocket a small phial, and filled up the glass from it. The light fell upon his face from above, and Curdie saw the snake in it plainly visible. He had never beheld such an evil countenance. The man hated the king, and delighted in doing him wrong. With the glass in his hand, he drew near the bed, set it down, and began his usual rude rousing of his majesty. Not at once succeeding, he took a lancet from his pocket, and was parting its cover with an involuntary hiss of hate between his closed teeth, when Curdie stooped and whispered to Lena, "Take him by the leg, Lena." She darted noiselessly upon him. With a face of horrible consternation, he gave his leg one tug to free it. The next instant Curdie heard the one scrunch with which she crushed the bone like a stick of celery. He tumbled on the floor with a yell. "Drag him out, Lena," said Curdie. Lena took him by the collar and dragged him out. Her master followed to direct her, and they left him lying across the Lord Chamberlain's door, where he gave another horrible yell, and fainted. The king had waked at his first cry, and by the time Curdie re-entered, he had got at his sword where it hung from the centre of the tester, had drawn it, and was trying to get out of bed. But when Curdie told him all was well, he lay down again as quietly as a child comforted by his mother from a troubled dream. Curdie went to the door to watch. The doctor's yells had roused many, but not one had yet ventured to appear. Bells were rung violently, but none were answered, and in a minute or two Curdie had what he was watching for. The door of the Lord Chamberlain's room opened, and, pale with hideous terror, his lordship peeped out. Seeing no one, he advanced to step into the corridor, and tumbled over the doctor. Curdie ran up and held out his hand. He received in it the claw of a bird of prey, vulture or eagle, he could not tell which. His lordship, as soon as he was on his legs, taking him for one of the pages, abused him heartily for not coming sooner, and threatened him with dismissal from the king's service for cowardice and neglect. He began indeed what bade fair to be a sermon on the duties of a page, but catching sight of the man who lay at his door, and seeing it was the doctor, he fell out upon Curdie afresh for standing there doing nothing, and ordered him to fetch immediate assistance. Curdie left him, but slipped into the king's chamber, closed and locked the door, and left the rascals to look after each other. Ere long he heard hurrying footsteps, and for a few minutes there was a great muffled tumult of scuffling feet, low voices, and deep groanings. Then all was still again. Irene slept through the whole, so confidently did she rest, knowing Curdie was in her father's room, watching over him.